Cool. So hi, I'm LJ. I debate for the University of Texas, and today I'm really excited to talk about one of my favorite topics ever, intrinsicness. The good news is that it's one of my favorite debate arguments, so I'm really passionate about it. The bad news is I will yap about it forever if you let me, so if you have questions, it's like very theoretically dense, like please raise your hand even if I'm in the middle of something. Cool. So to get started, first, we'll take a look at what intrinsicness means. So basically, intrinsic, just in general, means something that is germane to, essential to, or inseparable from something. So if something is germane to the plan or intrinsic to the plan, that means that it is sort of inseparable from the plan. So if the plan happens, that thing happens, or it is an essential part of the plan. So an example of maybe this not being true is if an affirmative tried to read a farm bill advantage that says farm bill does not pass now, but the affirmative gives Biden PC because winners win, which allows the farm bill to pass. Can anyone identify like what the strategic problem with this is? Yeah.
It's not a good disaster.
So yeah, maybe.
It's not intrinsic, but it's also just like really bad, like every part of the disaster.
Yeah, okay. So like what do you mean by not intrinsic?
Like, it's not really like, it sort of relies on like, it's not like a result of the plan, but like a result of like the process of the plan.
Well, I mean, it is a consequence of the plan. Yeah, what about you?
If it's based on winners win, that just means any single policy would always trigger the link to solve the farm bill side. It isn't germane to the app.
Yeah, so like how if you were negative, would you like
do any other counterplan, which would also solve the link because it's winners win?
Yeah, so you could like counterplan pass a different like popular policy. What's like another counterplan that's like even easier you could just do? Yeah?
Pass the farm bill.
Yeah, exactly. So like passing the farm bill is not something that is like the affirmative is not necessary to pass the farm bill. This advantage just like loses to an advantage counterplan that fiats we pass the farm bill. So then why can't the affirmative hold the negative to the same standard with the politics disad? So when the negative reads the politics disad, this is where disad is not intrinsic arguments come in. So like, for example, we could pass the farm bill despite the affirmative maybe draining political capital. A logical policymaker could just opt for both because the loss of political capital or passing the farm bill is not something that is intrinsic to the plan. This is often argued for using a standard called reciprocity, which is like if the affirmative could not do it, then the negative should not be able to do it. So reciprocity is a standard that does not tend to be super persuasive on its own. And this is because the affirmative and negative just have different burdens. So as you all know, the aff has the burden of proof, the neg has the burden of rejoinder. The affirmative gets to fiat the plan, but that plan has to stay within the limits of the topic. So you shouldn't just be able to fiat on anything outside of the scope of the topic. This begs the question of like the role of the judge as well. So like, are they a policymaker, like an informed bystander, just a person like adjudicating the debate or like what's more persuasive to them? And then also like, does the link argument itself disprove the ability of a logical policymaker to choose to do both? So like if the negative wins arguments about why like analysis of sort of political capital or political trade-offs that people face in real life when they are making policy is good for us to debate over, then it becomes really difficult to win this argument. So sort of in summary, intrinsicness tests on disads are a fun thing to like put as a one-liner in your 2AC that they can go for, that you can go for if they like drop it or severely mishandle it. But I would say that they're pretty controversial and can be a bit of an uphill battle to win compared to the time investment of just beating the politics disad on substance. So I do think that there is another way that we can think about intrinsicness where, in my opinion, it's more useful, which is counterplan theory. So on counterplans, did I accidentally go too many slides? Yeah, I think I did. One sec. Okay, there we go. So on counterplans, you'll often hear perms being called severance or intrinsic. So when a permutation is severance, that means that the permutation does not do the entire affirmative. When a permutation is intrinsic, that means that the permutation does something that is outside the scope of the plan and or the counterplan. So permutations can be textually intrinsic. So that would mean that the permutation adds a word or words that were not in the plan or counterplan text. And or they can also be functionally intrinsic. So a functional intrinsic perm would do something that is not in the plan, or that is not an action in the plan or the counterplan. So why would intrinsicness be problematic or theoretically illegitimate? So let's say somebody read like an advantage counterplan against a Russia advantage that was just like, let's set up some hotlines between the US and Russia, that solves war. And then they had a farm bill disad as the net benefit with a food insecurity impact. So if the affirmative can say, like fiating extra things onto the perm, they could say perm do the plan and have the USFG spend $1 bajillion on programs to end food insecurity. And that means that now there's no longer any impact to the net benefit, the permutation solves it, they can't go for the advantage counterplan and the farm bill disad. Because basically the affirmative could just use an intrinsic permutation to fiat out of the impact to any net benefit. So that's obviously like pretty unfair and bad. It basically means that the negative does not get any counterplans. But this just proves that giving the AF like unconstrained intrinsicness is bad. Maybe there is a version of this that can be more fair, right? So on the other side of things, you have like process counterplans and a subset of process counterplans, consult counterplans. So these aren't always like necessarily 100% bad, but they can definitely be a lot. There are basically infinite other countries, international organizations, or even like domestic organizations within the US where we could improve diplomacy or relations with them by consulting them on a US policy. So on the slide, you'll see an example of a sort of consult Japan counterplan. You can assume that it has an internal net benefit about sort of like strengthening the US-Japan alliance and that being key to deter China war. So if you try to say perm do the counterplan against this counterplan, there's an obvious procedural difference between the way that the AF and the counterplan work. Then you just get into the like sort of certainty and immediacy debate. And if you try to say perm do both, then they can say that prior binding consultation is key because the plan happening reveals that the consultation isn't genuine and can't solve relations, or would make it even worse because Japan knows we're lying to them about the consultation being binding. So that isn't to say that those negative arguments are unbeatable or necessarily true, but with the block's ability to dump cards and then probably being more familiar with their own specific process counterplan, it can make things very difficult for being AF, especially if the counterplan's process is less familiar to you, or if there's a limited set of evidence, maybe authors aren't really writing about it, or it's a new process counterplan and you haven't had the chance to cut cards. So basically, there are other cheaty perms, such as like the lie permutation that you can also read against consult counterplans, but for the sake of this lecture, we're just gonna focus on intrinsic perms. So what would this permutation look like? So this would be perm do the plan and consult Japan, and you can see what the full text is up on the slides. So you might notice that this permutation is not textually intrinsic. It only includes words from the plan and from the counterplan text. So do you all think that this permutation would resolve the internal net benefit? I just like raise your hands for yes. Yeah. Raise your hands for no. Okay, why not?
Oh, well, isn't there always some sort of internal benefit predicated off of why the consultation is key? So you have to do it first instead of doing the plan immediately and then consulting Japan?
So yes, but in this case, the intrinsic perm basically fiats that you do the plan and then you consult Japan over another issue.
Oh. No, that's all I think.
Okay, it solves. Does anyone else think it doesn't solve? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so basically, this permutation looks like Japan is consulted on a different policy, so relations are improved. The exception to this would, if they had a card saying that the consultation has to be over the plan exactly, then obviously this permutation would not solve the net benefit. Okay, so is this permutation functionally intrinsic? Raise your hands if you think it is. Okay, raise your hand if you think it's not intrinsic. Gotcha. Okay, great. So the correct answer is maybe. The end result of the perm is that Japan is consulted on something else not mandated by the counterplan text, which means that it could be functionally intrinsic. But as the affirmative, you can also argue that the permutation only fiats or actually mandates that the plan and the process or mechanism of consultation, it just never mandates or specifies what area the consultation occurs. So it just permutes the plan and then the counterplan's process of consultation. It just never says where that process occurs. So because you don't fiat a specific place where that process occurs, you're not actually mandating anything that is intrinsic, is the argument. So you can treat that AF argument as a sort of like we meet argument. If you win that the permutation isn't intrinsic at all, then you don't need to win an interpretation that justifies functional intrinsicness. But from this point on, when we're sort of like talking about debating intrinsicness, we'll operate assuming that the permutation is in fact functionally intrinsic. So we'll move on to sort of how you would justify that. So why is it bad for the negative to get to say counterplans like this and you not to get the intrinsic perm? So the first thing is the net benefit is not germane to the AF. It's a reason why consulting Japan over US policy is good, but not a reason why the plan is bad. The consult counterplan has let them sort of artificially fiat in the net benefit. Not only that, but to make matters worse, there are basically infinite countries, international organizations, groups within the US that could all be consulted. The AF needing cards to answer like every single one of these scenarios, every single one of these actors that we would consult, or like having a say no for everybody would be crazy. And it's also not going to be grounded in the literature base, so it's pretty likely that nobody who writes about the plan will write about should we do it on our own or should we consult Japan over it. And that's pretty bad for fairness in education because it means that the negative can just copy and paste the same process counterplan with an artificial net benefit, and then we have bad and shallow debates over it because the affirmative can never find cards that are actually good at answering it. So the main difference between like this style of argument and just saying that process counterplan's bad is that the intrinsic perm doesn't rely on winning a broader claim about process counterplans being bad, just certain ones where the net benefit isn't germane to the AF. So how does the intrinsic perm test whether or not the net benefit is germane to the AF at all? And sort of like what are the limits on it that make it more theoretically legitimate than a unlimited intrinsic perm that's just like we fiat away food insecurity, like in our first example. So the first limit or constraint on what the intrinsic perm can do in our example is their counterplan text. So we can't just fiat in random extra things to solve the net benefit because the perm still has to be textually non-intrinsic. So the food insecurity example earlier would not be allowed because food insecurity is nowhere in the counterplan text. So yeah, that resolves that, which is the primary reason why intrinsicness writ large is bad. The second limit on the permutation is their solvency advocate. So if they had a card saying that consulting Japan over the plan specifically was key, then the permutation wouldn't be able to solve the net benefit because Japan would want to be consulted on the plan. So the trade-off between doing the plan domestically and the counterplan's consultation would actually be intrinsic to the AF. So this is sort of analogous to like the disad intrinsicness test that we talked about, where you're sort of like trying to determine whether or not the net benefit is germane to the AF. This would also solve the literature-based concern that we talked about, because if there were solvency advocates saying that we should do a consultation on Japan over the AF specifically, there's more likely to be like authors writing about it, a back and forth dialogue on it, people who advocate the plan would be more likely to address it, things like that. Cool. Does anybody have any questions about like what this permutation text does or anything like that before we move on? Awesome. Oh, there we go. So basically what you're gonna do when you're trying to debate this argument is in the 2AC, you'll want to start the intrinsic perm with a sort of like tagline description. So for example, perm do the plan and consult Japan, and then insert the text below. Personally, I don't think that you need a theory block justifying it in the 2AC. It's up to the negative to identify that the perm is intrinsic, say like a theory violation, and then prove that that is theoretically illegitimate. That being said, my opinion is not the only one out there. Community thoughts vary, so if you know that your judge feels differently, or if their paradigm says that they want the theory block, or generally that they want a lot of 2AC explanations of permutations, you should obviously just do it. In rare cases, the neg team might not actually know what they're doing and might just miss that the permutation is intrinsic in general, which makes your job very easy. So moving on to the 1AR, you should say, one, that it's not intrinsic for the reasons that we discussed above. It just permutes the mechanism of the counterplan, doesn't specify where it's over. And then 2, that the permutation's limited form of functional intrinsicness is justified, even if intrinsicness writ large is not. So if the block's answer to the permutation is just like it's intrinsic and intrinsicness is bad, it is very easy to sort of get out of a lot of that offense using the arguments about like the limitations of the counterplan text and their solvency advocates that we discussed above. But if the argument is more specific to the permutation-specific type of functional intrinsicness, you do need to be a little bit more careful about explicitly answering their offense and be weighing sort of like your impacts about why the net benefit should have to be germane against theirs. So the 2AR. First, you have to sort of resolve the substantive question of perm solvency. So usually this won't really be contested by the negative, but you should always be briefly explaining what the permutation does and why it solves the net benefit. In most cases, I would say that the intrinsic perm probably solves the net benefit better because the consultation can be applied over a broader policy that the two countries can choose or agree upon. Also, don't forget that you can just go for the permutation isn't intrinsic, which essentially functions as a we meet argument, and you no longer have to sort of debate about the different interps. I've also seen, two NRs drop this argument so many times, and the 2ARs still not go for it, and each time that happens, a small part of me dies. Like, please, if you're AF and they drop that the perm isn't intrinsic, do not like chase ink and get caught up in the theory debate about whose interp is better. Like, for sure, you can just go for it's not intrinsic, we win. If it wasn't dropped, also like knowing your judge's opinion on this argument and watching their sort of facial expressions as this is being explained is very useful. I think it's important to be aware that like a lot of judges will have really strong preconceived notions on whether or not this permutation is intrinsic or not. So even if you think that you're like factually a little bit ahead on a tech level on this we meet argument, it is usually still a good idea to include the theoretical justification for it as well. So similarly to other theory debates, when you are debating back and forth on the interpretation, you need a lot of impact calculus using framing of what these debates look like under both of your interpretations. So the first thing is pretty similar to like topicality or conditionality debates. You need to frame the world of their interpretation as very, very scary. Negative teams can now cut a solvency advocate about consulting any entity. It doesn't need to be specific to the affirmative or even the topic. And then they can add an artificial net benefit about the US improving relations with that country, group, international organization, all of those things. And then AF teams would instantly lose unless they can find cards saying that every single other possible process that the affirmative could go through is bad, which is clearly a very unreasonable burden. And the affirmative's literature base will not have answers to any of this because the net benefit is so far removed from the actual real world discussions of the AF. So like when people are discussing, should we do injunctions, yes or no, very few of them are like, okay, well, we should do injunctions, but the real question is, do we consult Japan about it? So the other thing that's important in your 2ARs is to make sure that you also have defense. So you should explain how their impacts to intrinsicness is adequately checked by text and solvency advocates. So now we'll just sort of look at like answering arguments that neg teams use as sort of like offense against your interpretation a lot of the time. I would say the most common one is probably neg ground. So they'll say like the intrinsic perm takes away our ability to go for these counter plans. We need them. They're good for education, etc. So I think that this topic especially is pretty good for neg ground. They have unifying generics like IP bad, ban IP, sui generis and spillover, court clog, and also the CAPK, which is broken on this topic if you ask me. So if you need a process counterplan to win, that might be a skill issue. They still also get process counterplans under your interpretation. They just need to have a net benefit that's actually germane to the affirmative. And once again, the bright line for germaneness to the affirmative is whether or not they have a solvency advocate saying that doing the counterplans process over the AF specifically is key. Then the sort of like last argument that I would make is that even if process education is good or important more broadly First, their form of it isn't, because it allows them to artificially fiat in net benefits about processes that aren't actually discussed in the context of the app, which decks fairness and also means that like the types of process debates that we have aren't the ones that are actually important. And then two, your fairness impacts outweigh. They make it literally impossible to be asked because you now have to have a defense of basically why the affirmative should go through just like the normal process as opposed to consulting any other entity or devolving the authority to some other entity and letting them do it, which is obviously a very unfair burden to hold the affirmative to. Does anyone have questions about mid-ground? Cool. So another common argument that NIG teams will make is they'll say that the permutation is too vague, or sort of not specifying what the permutation is over would be bad because the negative can't get any offense against the perm. So you should be like, that's kind of the point. Like the point of the permutation is to just permute the mechanism and process of the counterplan as explained in the sort of like we meet, we're not intrinsic argument. And then again, if they had a card saying that consulting over the app specifically is key or the only good thing to consult over, then the permutation wouldn't resolve the net benefit. But unless they have that card in the first place, it wouldn't really help them for us to specify another policy that we specifically consult over. It would just make the permutation less legitimate. Yeah.
So like what if so they're gonna say like either, or maybe this is what you're just saying, like either it's going to be over another thing that's intrinsic, or you haven't specified what we're gonna consult Japan over, and so we're just gonna go to them and say consult, and they're like, what?
Yeah, so yeah, I think so. And honestly, like this is less of a solvency argument, but more of like a theory argument. So like, because you didn't specify the thing that we consult over, like even if they do agree on a policy, the negative team doesn't know what that policy that they'll agree over is, or what that policy that you're consulting over is. So the negative then can't go and say consulting Japan on XYZ specific policy is bad as an answer to the permutation. And the negative will argue that they should be able to say that. And then also, like the other thing I would add is that like answering the we meet argument doesn't preclude the negative from also saying this, because they can still say that it's intrinsic, and then it's still also true that like the permutation has not specified what area the app is over. Or sorry, what area the permutation happens over. So they can say both. It doesn't like require them conceding one, if that makes sense. Cool. Anything else right now? Awesome. So another thing that will be pretty common is for the negative to say textual competition is bad, or like a bad basis to base our competition off of. This is sort of like applicable because obviously the permutation is textually non-intrinsic, but it is also functionally intrinsic, or assuming that you don't win the we meet argument, it's functionally intrinsic. So basically sort of like basing competition on text is bad. So like your first line of defense can just be like normal counterplan should be functionally and textually competitive. You can also just say textual competition is good and have that debate. But also I do think that like the permutation makes it a little bit easier to win this argument, because again, you can talk about how like the solvency advocate limit on the permutation solves enough of their offense for why textual competition would be unfair to them. And then also a similar argument, like your germaneness and fairness in education offense outweighs. And you still wouldn't be able to make this permutation against a counterplan that had a germane net benefit. So like maybe textual competition is not a standard that the NIG should have to be held to usually, but is a standard that they should be held to in order to pass the intrinsicness test that the permutation proposes. Cool. Another thing that negative teams will accuse you of doing is AF conditionality. Basically saying that the permutation allows you to shift what the affirmative does by fiating in something else. The first answer should be like, this is not AF conditionality, it's just like permutations are only a test of competition, they're not an advocacy. If they kick the counter plan, we can't use it to get out of a disad that stands on its own or some other net benefit. It also still defends the entire AF, like this permutation is definitely not severance. And then finally, the textual limitation on the permutation solves their offense. So it means that we can't shift out of any links unless the counterplan text itself would allow us to solve it. And us being limited to the counterplan text prevents us from permuting anything that differs greatly from the counterplan's mandate. So like, again, we can't fiat in like solving for food insecurity. Sort of a last common argument is that if the counterplan is bad or illegitimate, just beat it on theory. I think that you should say that this misunderstands the argument. We agree that process counterplans can actually sometimes be good, but only if the net benefit is germane to the affirmative. And only the permutation allows us to test this, because it would be too arbitrary in a theory debate for like process counterplans bad, just to generally say they're only legitimate if the net benefit is germane to the AF or not, because we don't have a way of testing that if we're not allowed to make the intrinsic perm. Also, it's 2024, nobody votes on process counterplan theory. Cool. So for some FAQs, and then we'll get into like any questions y'all have, and then we have some sort of time to practice. So first, like, what is the strategic benefit of this permutation? Why is it easier for you to go for it instead of just process counterplans bad? So the strategic benefit of this permutation is that the burden that you have to win is lower. You don't have to win that all process counterplans are categorically bad. Just ones with net benefits that aren't germane to the AF or have been artificially fiated in. And this is helpful because it gets you out of a lot of sort of the negatives, like process education is important and ground offense, because you get to sort of like make that distinction. And also some judges just have like a sort of like psychological barrier to where they don't really want to vote on counterplan theory other than conditionality. It can sometimes just be perceptually easier to win. The next sort of FAQ is, do you have to win that textual competition is good and that functional competition is bad? I think that like for some people, they would say yes. It's definitely like a perception thing, but in my opinion, not necessarily, because I think that you also have the sort of solvency advocate limit on the permutations function, which makes this different than just sort of like normal textual competition good. But also you definitely have to explain why that's true. So if you're like, I'm ignoring the textual competition good debate, which I would not like recommend, you should like explain why you don't have to win it. So like we don't have to win that textual competition is good in the abstract because like the permutation being limited by their solvency advocate means that it's not just textual competition. It's a higher standard than that. Another thing is, do you have to insert the perm text and why? I think that you always should, because it proves that the permutation is not textually intrinsic. Although for sort of like simpler consult counterplans, some judges might be okay with just like perm to the AF and consult Japan. In my opinion, if you're trying to go for this permutation, it's always better to just not risk it and insert the full permutation text. That being said, like I've never met a judge who is like, you must read the full perm text out loud. So don't waste your time doing that. And then the sort of like last thing before I'll open it up to like questions and examples is like, why should you care about intrinsic perms? So I would say that it's because this is like applicable to a broad range of counterplans. It's a really useful tool that you can use whenever you're hitting like a new and unfamiliar process counterplan. You can sort of take the debate out of sort of whether or not you can contest the negative specific agent or process, and sort of refocus it on a theory debate where you're a little bit more comfortable and where they might not be as used to defending. Also, being knowledgeable about this argument can help you beat teams that are usually more experienced or competitively successful than you, because you can sort of recenter the debate into this niche. Also, learning about it if you're a 2N can really prevent you from fully understanding it, being able to identify when these permutations are intrinsic, and not messing up and losing to it in your negative debates. Cool. Before we start practicing, does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
But can you go over like how is like doesn't like this perm like rely on like winning like textual competition is good or textual and functional competition is good, or like can you explain like why that's like how like you can like limit it so that you don't have to like win that whole debate?
Yeah, for sure. So basically the argument is that the permutation sort of has, or the justification for our permutation or our interp of what type of intrinsicness is allowed is not just that it has to be limited to the counterplan text. It's also a sort of like functional argument that if the solvency advocate was specific to the affirmative, the permutation just wouldn't solve, right? So that means that it's a little bit less just reliant on textual competition, because theoretically, even if the counterplan's text allowed us to make this permutation, if it didn't solve, that wouldn't matter. So the negative can get around the sort of like textual competition part, or like they don't have to prove that it's textually competitive if they have the app-specific solvency advocate. Which means that just winning textual competition is bad in the abstract does not account for our specific interpretation of intrinsicness. Does that make sense? Cool. If you like need follow-ups, let me know. Yeah. What's your question?
Why would they say textual competition bad? Isn't that their argument against perm to the counterplan?
Well, their argument will be that usually, like with the consult counterplans, it'll include most of the counterplan, most of the plan text. So they'll say that textual competition is a bad standard to like hold the negative to. So like counterplans don't have to be functionally and textually competitive, just functionally.
Okay.
So like, yeah. The consult counterplan is functionally competitive because it does the consultation process rather than like unilaterally passing the app.
Okay, and then we're trying to win this permutation would be like it's limited intrinsicness, it's a different interpretation of intrinsicness. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily that we meet not intrinsic.
Yeah. So that's sort of an argument where I would say you should definitely extend it if they drop it, but also that like certain judges, I think, like will not vote on if they contest it. So most of the time you are going to have to win that your interpretation is better. Cool. Anything else before we do practice? Cool. So for this first example, I'll stand up for this. So for this first example, we have uncooperative federalism counterplan. I don't know if you all have seen this. I have an example from the water topic. Basically what this counterplan does is it fiats that the leaders of states tell the federal government that they are not going to cooperate with them anymore unless they do the plan. And that essentially pressures the federal government into doing the plan. And that's good because it gives the states influence over federal policies, sets that sort of precedent, and then allows the states to be able to do usually extra things that might be good for like the environment. During the height of the COVID pandemic, there were like net benefits about that too. So yeah, when you try to perm devote this counterplan, they will say that it doesn't work because the government like fiats the plan right away, which means that there's never like a sort of negotiation or use of the state's leverage. If you try to perm do the counterplan, they will say that the counterplan never fiats the AF. Cool, so does anybody have ideas for how we would craft the intrinsic perm text using this? Yeah.
Just like perm do the United States federal privilege should mandate compliance with the regulatory framework for water reuse. And then the National Governors Association should inform the White House that state cooperation with federal incentives, they should just do that, and then exclude the relevant water protection policy part, so it's just.
So the National Governors Association should inform the White House that state cooperation with federal initiatives, and
Will
then,
be contingent upon, or it will be contingent upon the United States mandating compliance.
mandating compliance. Okay, yeah. So I do think that that could work. However, I think that when you phrase it like that, it sounds like, okay, the National Governors Association should inform the White House that state cooperation with federal initiatives will be contingent upon the United States mandating compliance. I think that this probably sounds like the states will not cooperate until the federal government mandates the states to cooperate over the federal policies. So that probably would not solve, yeah.
The United Plan plus the NGA should inform the White House that state cooperation with federal initiatives will be contingent upon the United States mandating compliance with the regulatory framework.
Yeah, that sounds good. So you never specify what the regulatory framework is. Could be over water, could be something else, yeah. Any other ideas before we move on to the next one? Yeah.
Did you say do the plan and then all the counterplan text up to will be contingent?
Should inform the White House that state cooperation with federal initiatives, including relevant water protection policies, will be contingent.
And then just don't specify
And
what
then-
it's contingent upon.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes it contingent upon something, yeah. So you could definitely try that, yeah.
Does the net benefit not have something to do with them ceasing relevant water protection policies, the states? You don't have to do that as well to result in a benefit?
So probably not. I think that the states being like, we will not cooperate with any federal initiatives might actually solve better and make it more likely for the federal government to say yes, because they probably care about that more and have like more power over that than water policies. Cool. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on to the next example?
What's even the purpose of including relevant water protection policies if you can just put federal initiatives that would include water protection policies?
Ask the 2N that wrote this counterplan text for sure. I think that it's supposed to be that like they will also like refuse to comply with the plan unless or like they will also refuse to comply with like anything in the area of the plan or anything opposing the plan until the federal government has passed the plan. But yeah, I don't think it's really necessary if you are a 2N and trying to write this counterplan text. Yeah. Yeah.
So the goal leads permutations is to do the plan and the counterplan, but then you just be as vague as possible in doing the counterplan, trying to take out words.
Yeah, so we'll discuss this later, but like be as vague as possible can have sort of like different levels, and sometimes you might not want to be as vague as possible. So we'll definitely like see that in some other examples. You will have like options for how vague you want to be. For example, like is it over the topic area, so like water protection, or is it open to any federal policy? Cool. So for the second example, we have the Lopez counterplan or the devolution counterplan. This counterplan is definitely just like illegitimate, like you should just beat it on theory, but I think that it's a sort of good exercise for thinking about the way that we can apply the intrinsic perm to other types of counterplans other than just sort of consulting. So basically, this counterplan is based off of a Supreme Court case called US v. Lopez, in which the Supreme Court ruled that the states had authority over gun laws rather than the federal government. So basically, what this counterplan does is it devolves all authority over the area of the act to the states and then fiats that the states do the plan. The reason why I think this counterplan should 100% be like theoretically illegitimate is because like fiating the devolution of authority itself, first of all, is probably a little bit bad because it means that like all of the Fed key warrants just basically disappear. The other thing is that then fiating, the combination of that with then fiating that the states do it means that there's no sort of like room for a say yes or say no argument. So yeah, definitely theoretically not legitimate. Do not let 2Ns do this to you, but also just a fun exercise. So basically the net benefit will usually be about federalism. Sometimes people will say the politics, or sometimes people will say the politics decide, but usually you can win that like would link because the federal government would still have to pass a policy devolving the authority. So yeah, we'll just assume that it's an internal federalism net benefit for the purposes of this exercise. Does anyone have any perm ideas? Yeah.
Plan, and then the United States federal government should rule, and then the states and relevant sub-federal governments should significantly strengthen.
So the United States federal government should rule.
And then just go down to the states and relevant sub-federal governments should significantly strengthen.
Okay. So I think that the maybe like issue with this is that it looks like the federal government never devolves the authority, and they just rule that the states and relevant sub-federal governments have to do something, which it seems like would not solve the federalism internal net benefit. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other ideas? Yeah.
Plan, and then plan plus the United States federal government should apply the ruling in United States versus Lopez, and then the states and relevant sub-federal governments should significantly strengthen.
Mm-hmm. Should significantly strengthen, just like.
Protection.
Okay. Yeah. So that could work. I do feel like, yeah, sometimes the like significantly strengthened part like does make it seem a little bit weird, but you can probably like justify it. Yeah.
Either the other issue is protection or protection of rights or protection of property,
Mm-hmm.
or actually that would work. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. I have sort of like, I think that those would work, and those are all like different variations. Another thing you can do in the 2AC is have like multiple different perm texts that do like slightly different things, if that's something that you want. So good idea. I guess like my question for you all is, why do we think that this second sentence like has to be included at all? Yeah.
Because otherwise the states just have the authority to do it and they don't actually enact the plan.
Okay, but why is that important for solving the net benefit? Yeah.
It isn't.
It isn't, yeah. So like the federal government devolving authority to the states changes the balance of power in federalism in favor of the states, which means that it would still presumably solve the net benefit. I don't think that the negative will have cards saying that the states actually need to like first use that power in order for it to work. Yeah.
But in that scenario, does the perm not also have to solve? Well, I guess because you're doing plan plus.
Yeah.
It still solves, yeah.
So the permutation, the reason that it wouldn't solve is because when the federal government like also is regulating the same area as the states, something called preemption applies, which basically means that the states lose the right to regulate that area. Cool. Yeah. So I think that like given that we can ignore this last part, does anybody have other ideas? Mm-hmm.
Plan, and then the United States federal government should apply the ruling in United States versus Lopez.
Yep. And that's it. Yeah, you just like don't specify where it's over. You can also make it like a little bit more. You can also make it like a little bit more specific if you want. You can have variations like the United States federal government should apply the ruling in U.S. v. Lopez, or like applying the ruling in U.S. v. Lopez rule that like domestic rights falls under exclusive states authority, or rights falls under exclusive state authority, like literally anything. But yeah, something that you want to be careful about is when you change the word applying to apply, you can sort of open yourself up to some more theory objections involving sort of the concept of like, are you allowed to actually alter words? So even though you're able to sort of like take away words, or maybe even word scramble, once you start like actually changing words, this can look a little bit more theoretically illegitimate, because it's like, what's next, like letter scramble, you can like play wordscapes with the counterplan text and like make a perm, yeah.
Or does this like get into like the bare plural argument, if you say like if you make like the intrinsic perm use like protection of rights or protection of property, like could like the neg say rights or property, both intellectual property as a subset of property?
So yeah, but you could also say that the permutation like doesn't have to occur over all property, it could just be like also over a different subsection of
But
property.
like, what if like the neg says that like, or like the definition of like a plural, or like the definition of property means like in a legal context where you don't specify means all or something?
I mean, yeah, maybe. But also then like in that case, it would just sort of become like a similar debate to like the carve out perm. So they would have to then win that like devolving authority over all of the rest of property is not enough if the plan takes away like intellectual property from that specifically.
Okay.
Does that, because like the plan part of the perm would then be like a carve out to where the federal government still preempts over intellectual property. So yeah. Cool. Any other questions about this? Yeah, so like a counterplan text that avoids that concern could just be like the United States federal government should, applying the ruling in United States v. Lopez, rule that protection of rights falls under exclusive state authority or something like that. Cool. Next thing. There we go. Okay. Example number 3 is the race audits counterplan. Basically, what this counterplan does is before the affirmative happens, they submit it for an independent racial audit statement to see like the impacts that this would have on racial inequality in the United States, and then they only do the plan if it's determined to be equitable. The net benefit is basically that this sets a precedent that policies should be like audited using the race audit system, and then like makes policy more equitable in the US in general. Yeah. Does anybody have any ideas on this? Oh, yeah, sorry.
You're good.
Wait, how is it?
You just take the words of the plan,
Wait, how is the counterplan different from the plan?
Term to the plan, and the United States federal government ought to submit
right? At the United States.
for a prior and binding, ought to submit the plan for a prior and binding racial impact statement.
Mm-hmm.
What is the plan? I don't know.
Yeah, so like when you say the plan, you could say that like the plan refers to any other USFG plan,
Exactly.
but also they could try to say like that means that it is the APS plan, which basically is the same thing as perm to the counter plan, fails for the same reasons. But yeah, I think you're definitely on the right track.
Could you just not say the plan,
The
ought to
plan is
submit
also-
for a prior and binding
Mm-hmm.
racial impact statement?
Yeah. So you could just say, you could even just say the United States federal government should require a prior and binding racial impact statement. And then that would resolve the net benefit because like spillover. And the thing is like also going back to sort of our theory debates, like if the negative had a card being like only having a prior and binding racial impact statement over algorithms effectively like sets the precedent, then obviously that permutation would not solve, right? It's just that because they don't, you're able to like make it really big. You could also like have it be over like other affirmative action. So you could be like the United States federal government ought to require risk assessments for algorithmic outputs for a prior and binding racial impact statement. So like you can play around with how specific it is. So like for example, if they had a solvency advocate that was specific to intellectual property rights, but not specific to the plan, you could have the perm be over intellectual property rights and not just over any US policy, and that would still solve. So you can sort of like play around with what you want the threshold for their solvency advocate to be. Cool. That's my last example. Any sort of like final questions? Awesome. Okay, well, we're a little over, so I'll let y'all go to lunch. Feel free to email if you have any questions, and thanks.